does my shirt look like that? It's just going to be what it is today, apparently. Welcome back to episode 2 of The View from 4 feet and 3 inches. In case you don't know me, my name is Cassidy Huff. Let's get into this week's episode. I wish that I had like a theme song or something. I don't know. Maybe in the future I will. Or maybe I'll be like Emma Chamberlain and just won't have that. So today's episode is going to be about going out in public as a disabled person. And when I was writing this idea down, I originally thought this episode was going to be about the accommodations that I have to think about when going out in public. But as I was kind of scripting what I wanted to talk about for this episode, I realized that what I really wanted to talk about was how I handle the interactions with strangers out in public, because I get comments all the time, whether it's on my Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whatever, from like young disabled people or even older disabled people, like older than me, that say that I have inspired them to go out in public with their disability, and they're now not ashamed of their disability because of me and because of the videos that I make. And I often get a lot of questions about how I'm so confident out in public with my disability, and how I became so comfortable in my own skin. And I feel like I've been lying to all of you without intentionally doing it. I feel like I have been creating this facade somehow that like I'm confident when I'm out in public, and that's just not the case. That's just not how I see myself, and that's really not how I am. When I'm out in public, there's still a lot of self-consciousness that goes around my disability. When I'm out at the store or shopping or whatever. So today I kind of wanted to take you through my life of how I felt when I was disabled when I was younger going out in public, and how I feel now, and kind of the evolution of how that has all changed. So let's start when I was really young. By the way, for everybody who's watching the video version of this with like the visuals, either on YouTube or on Spotify, I'm looking at my notes over here, so that's why I keep looking down. I was editing last week's podcast, and I just felt like while I was editing it that I was so stiff and like not relaxed, and I just kept thinking to myself, like, why do I look like that? Why do I look like I'm not having a good time? Like, I was just so rigid, and I don't want to look like that. I want to look like I'm relaxed and like inviting you into my home. I don't want to look like I'm super scripted or whatever. And that was also making it really hard for me to edit, because I was saying things multiple times because I didn't like how I said it the last time. And so then it just sounded like my YouTube videos and not like a long form kind of conversation with you. It sounded like my short form videos. I also realized while I was editing last week's episode that you can hear Champy in the background, and he's snoring, and I don't care how good the mic is. It just is what it is. I've had to like wake him up during like actual voiceover sessions, like for DreamWorks or Mattel or whatever, because he's snoring so loud in the booth. And so I keep having to like nudge him with my foot to keep him awake. So it's just what it's gonna be. You're probably gonna hear him snoring in the background, and I apologize. Anyways, a giant truck just went by my window. That seems to be the theme for The View from 4 feet and 3 inches. Anyways, so when I was younger, I was a very outgoing child. Like, I love to perform. I love to be the center of attention, just like now. But I was always, when I was younger, I thought being disabled was normal. And so it wasn't until I started going to school, and it wasn't until my little sister was born and she was doing things differently than I was doing them, and like she wasn't having to go through surgeries every 6 months and things like that, that I realized like, oh, this is not a normal existence. Like, people don't go through these things every day. And so I was always I was always under the impression that my existence and the way I moved through the world was just how everybody else moved through the world, until I became like 4, 5, 6 years old, and then I realized, oh, not everybody looks like me. I don't know how I feel about that. I was very confident until I started going to school, because with public school comes bullying, and so I was getting bullied a lot for obviously things that were out of my control, just because kids are mean and they see something that's different, and people are scared of different. So I was getting picked on a lot, which made me scared to go out in public. And it wasn't exactly like I was terrified, it was more that I was anxious. And I recognized that when I would go out in public, people would stare at me, and it wasn't just kids my own age, like at school, it was like adults would stare at me, and it made me really uncomfortable, because a grown adult staring at a small child's body, like, that still rubs me the wrong way. So it rubbed me the wrong way at a very young age, and I was always very perplexed by it, and I didn't understand the curiosity, because again, I was just figuring out that this wasn't the way everybody looked. So I was very confused as to why people were curious about me. And I was curious about other people, but I was more curious about getting to know them, and I didn't really care about what they looked like or how they dressed or if they had disabilities. Like, that didn't even really cross my mind. So I was always really confused about why people were staring at me. And then on the rare occasion that somebody did come up to ask me a question, I was just kind of like, well, yeah, like, don't you know? Like, shouldn't you know this information? So I was always really anxious to go out in public, just because I knew people would stare at me, and I knew that while I didn't really care that they were curious, my mom hated it. Like, she hated that people looked at me differently. She just wanted people to treat me like I was a human, rightfully so. And to me, I was normal. Like, to her, I was normal. So to her, I was just her daughter, and I was no different than my sister. So that's how she looked at me. And I know that she was like 23 when she had me, so I'm around her age. I'm around the age now that she was when she had me. And I would also be very overprotective of my child if they were disabled, I don't know. I feel like she would get very overprotective, and would say things to the person that was staring. If they were a child, she'd usually let it go. But if they were an adult and they knew better, she'd be like, hey, like, let's not stare, or like, staring's rude, or don't stare at her, or things like that. And so I became embarrassed mainly because I didn't want my mom to say things. But also, like, what's she gonna do? She is just sticking up for me, and that's the way she knew how to do it. My grandma would also get pretty upset. My grandma approached it more of like, look, you can educate people. And I was like, but why? I understand it now. Like, I genuinely love educating people. But back then I was like, but why don't they know? like, why don't they know the answers to these questions? Now I understand what she was trying to say. But when I was younger, I was like, what do you mean I can educate people? So she also said things to people who were staring, but she approached it from like a, oh, do you have a question standpoint? Like, do you want to ask her something? Like, she's nice, she doesn't bite, and so she approached it in a kinder way, I think, than my mom did. My mom was very much like, don't stare at her. Stop. And so because my mom was doing that, my sister also grew up learning that way. And so she was always like, oh, staring's rude. Stop staring. Like, don't stare at her. And I think that at the time, that was very, it was very standard. It was very like, ignore the disabled person, But now I like when people ask questions. I still get really self-conscious when people stare though, because I'm like, okay, like stop. I have had people take pictures of me. I was especially really anxious when I was younger because people would follow us around stores, and I hated that because there's someone in my hallway. Anyways, what is actually happening outside right now? Whatever. If you guys hear outside noise, I apologize. I have had people take pictures of me. I've had people follow us, and that was the most anxiety inducing part for me, was because I was a woman, or I was a little girl at that point. I was a little girl, so I was already vulnerable. I was a small child, so already I was even more vulnerable. And also, I was a very small, like petite child. I'm a very small, petite adult. And so that made me feel super vulnerable. And I remember just being like really on edge in public because I was like, all right, I can't do anything to stop somebody, if they try something, what am I supposed to do? So I always like tried to hide behind my mom. I was always very close to my mom. I never really strayed very far because I was just very anxious about strangers, because strangers would come up to me and ask me very personal questions, even as a young child. My mom said that people would touch me when I was younger. I had that happen when I was like an older child too. People would touch me. Either they would, when I would fall, they would try to grab me and like pick me up. And my mom was always very anxious about that because I had surgery every 6 months. So I was very fragile. Like, you wouldn't break me, but like 9 times out of 10, I was recovering from surgery. So you probably would hurt me. And she was really the only one in, like, my family obviously was too, but she was the only one really who knew how to pick me up correctly. So she was always really anxious about people trying to pick me up to help me, because they could easily pick me up the wrong way and hurt me instead. And so I remember she was also telling me that when I was younger, and even still now, my head, because of my neck and my spine, it naturally wants to tilt to the right. And it's better now. It's still, when I'm tired, just kind of drifts that way. But when I was younger, it was really bad because I was recovering all the time. And when I was a baby, my mom said people would reach into my stroller and grab my head and move it so that it was like straight. And my mom was like, hey, don't touch my baby. Like, a random stranger just comes up to your baby and like moves their head. First of all, I clearly had other medical things going on. How do you know that you're not gonna like break a bone in my body by doing that? Like, that's ridiculous. And I was a baby, so it wasn't like I could say, hey, don't touch me, hey, stop, Like, my mom would just like turn her back for a second and then turn back around, and a random stranger was touching her child. Like, don't do that. So I was always very very anxious about going into public, if it wasn't going to the hospital or going to an event to perform. Those are really the only 2 places I felt really comfortable when I was really young, like a 4 or 5-year-old. But going to a store, going shopping, going to the movies, I was always super, super anxious. I'm going to take a break now, and then when we come back, I will discuss and tell you guys how it kind of changed from when I was a kid to when I was like an early teen, and how I handled public interaction then. All right, we are back with the view from 4 feet and 3 inches. I was going to say 3 feet and 4 inches, but that is not true. So that's how I felt when I was younger, like a young child, and in public. Now, when I got into my early teen years, it changed a little bit. That perspective changed. And this is, I think, mainly because when I was 13, I got my first wheelchair. Like, my first custom wheelchair. Before that, I had my prosthesis, which all of you have seen by now. It looks like I have 3 feet. You know what I'm talking about. And I had a motorized scooter too, so I had mobility aids, like I had glasses and a hearing aid and whatever, but they weren't as apparent as my manual chair. So I got my first manual chair, which I still have today, and so obviously I looked, I guess, more disabled out in public. And then when I turned 14, I had my spinal fusion. So because I had my spinal fusion, I had to wear a back brace for 3 months, 6 months, I don't remember. But it went all the way up to my neck and then went all the way down to my hips. So it was large. I hated that thing. Hated it. My mom had to bribe me to wear it. Absolutely hated it because it didn't look cool. Are you kidding? I also had fresh scars on my forehead because I was in halo traction. So basically I had 8 pins screwed into my head before my spinal fusion. I lived in the hospital for 52 days. It was a whole thing. And maybe I'll go into that in another episode. But it was a whole thing. And so I had fresh scars on my forehead. I was in a wheelchair, brand new wheelchair. I had a back brace. And then because of my halo traction, you couldn't take the halo off. All right. I think they were titanium pins in my head. So they were metal and you couldn't take them out. They were surgically placed in there. And they literally had to drill a hole in your head. Sorry if you're squeamish. I apologize. And because of the way they put it in, my surgeon had a daughter, but he did not think this through. He accidentally, when he was putting the halo in, in the OR, he wrapped my hair, which was about as long as it is now, so shoulder length-ish, so long enough. He wrapped my hair around the pins, and so it made it literally impossible to wash, brush, anything. And because I had metal in my head, you couldn't really get in with a brush to brush them. Anyways, so it was nearly impossible, and I literally could not brush my hair. So I made the decision to just cut all my hair off. So and then once I got out of the hospital, because I had to cut all my hair off and it was a really hard decision for me to make, but it was necessary, my mom promised me that I could dye it any color I wanted as soon as I got out of the hospital. So this meant that once I was discharged, I immediately was like, I'm dyeing my hair purple. As a 14-year-old teenage girl, sure, do it. So I dyed my hair purple. Not only did I have a brand new manual wheelchair, a prosthesis that makes it look like I have 3 feet, glasses, a hearing aid, but I also had a giant back brace that we called a turtle shell because essentially that's what it looked like. It had the Seahawks logo all over it. The Seahawks football team, it had that logo all over it. Because that's, I guess, what I wanted on there. And I had a pixie cut and purple hair. So once I started going out in public like that, I really just kind of had an attitude about people looking at me. I was like, I don't even care anymore. If they're going to stare, I'm going to give them something to stare at. At this point, I don't know what they're looking at more. Are they looking at my 3 feet? Are they looking at my turtle shell of a back brace? Are they looking at my my wheelchair trying to figure out what disability I have? Are they looking at the bloody scars, new scars that I have on my forehead? Are they looking at my purple pixie cut? What are they looking at? So, I kind of had that kind of attitude as a younger teenager, early teenager, because I was like, no, if you're going to look at me, I'm going to give you something to look at. Go ahead, look at me, take a picture, it'll last longer. So I no longer cared at that point, because I had more mobility aids. And at that point, I started not really embracing my disabilities, but more being a little bit spiteful of people who wanted to stare at me. And that didn't last very long. It probably lasted for 2-ish years. But I was still at the point, I don't know, I was a very, very kind person. I still think I am, but I was still very kind. I just didn't care, really. My family's attitudes in public didn't change. They were still getting angry for me, like on my behalf towards other people who were staring at me. So that didn't change at all. They still kept that up. And I thank them for it. I appreciate the fact that they're protective of me, even though I found it embarrassing then, and still at times I find it embarrassing. I'm like, okay, guys, that's enough. Like, that's okay. So let's talk about how I feel going out in public now, because I think people see this B-roll of me going out in public, that I post, like they see the videos that I post where I'm in the mall rolling myself in my chair, or Champ and I are at the craft store, or my boyfriend and I are out in public, whatever. And they're like, wow, she's so confident in her disability. No, that is not the case. I am still on a self-love / discovery journey, like everybody is, I believe. Sometimes I'm very confident in my disabled body, and other times I'm not. And that is the majority of the time. The majority of the time, I am not very confident in how I look, and how the public perceives me as a disabled woman. It's not that I ignore people who are staring at me out in public. I feel like I notice it less because it happens so often. I know that if I walk out of my apartment right now, people are going to stare at me. However, I genuinely don't see them staring at me. I think in my head, I'm like, oh, they're smiling at me because they want to be friends, just because I want to be friends with everybody. So that's what I do. So then I'm like, oh, that's what they're doing, That's sometimes the case and sometimes not the case. But genuinely, I don't really pay attention to people who stare, just because I don't see them. Like I don't mean to ignore them. I just don't see them anymore, just because it happens so much. However, I am still pretty self-conscious, especially when Kaz, my boyfriend, and I are out in public. This is because, actually, I don't know why it is. Maybe somebody in the comments can figure it out for me. But I have, for the entirety of our relationship, always been very self-conscious of people looking at me, people looking at us, people trying to figure out our relationship to each other, because usually people think that he's either my brother or my caregiver. People never think we're dating, unless it's another disabled person. Then they're like, oh, you guys are together. We're like, yeah. But usually non-disabled people never think we're dating. And I think that stems from the ableist mindset of, even if it's not intentional, I think it's rooted in ableism, just because people don't think disabled people date, which is not true, but that's the ableist mindset. That's kind of what society has taught us, right? So I think that they think, oh, there's no way they're dating, but I've always been super self-conscious of him and I out in public, showing any kind of affection. He has not. He's never showed any kind of anxiety towards that at all. He's always just kind of been like, yeah, so, okay, let him stare. Like, I don't care. He works with kids. He works with high school kids. And I also, sometimes go to their events and stuff like that, football games, whatever. And he is always like, oh, that's a really long walk. Do you want your chair? And I'm like, no, I never want my chair, because I'm embarrassed by it. Truthfully, it's because I'm embarrassed by it. I don't want the high school kids to see me like that. And I know that sounds so stupid, because they're high school kids and I'm a grown adult. Like, I am 5 years older than most of those kids, and I'm so embarrassed by my wheelchair. Or even when he's like, hey, that's a really long walk, do you want me to carry you? Because he's actually, offering that, and he's trying to be helpful, and I will automatically every single time be like, no, I don't want that. Actually, do not carry me. And I don't know why that is. I don't know why I'm so embarrassed by it, but truthfully, it's almost shame. It is shame that I feel every time he offers something that he knows and I know I need. Like, that's what will help me, but I'm so, like, opposed to it because I think it's embarrassing. Why? Why do I think it's embarrassing? Does anybody else feel like this? Is this like a disability thing? Like, is this some shared experience that all disabled people have? Or is this just me? Am I just weird? I don't know. Because I've moved out of my house and my home state that I lived in for 19 years, my family never really goes out in public with me anymore because I don't live with them. However, I see Kaz's family a lot, and his mom gets not upset, but more like, why are they staring at you? Like, what? And I'm like, I don't know. It just happens, or she'll be like, hey, that's like, stop staring, and kind of like my mom. So it must be like a mom thing. I don't know. But my mom still gets pretty overprotective whenever we're out in public together. Both the moms do. I now have gotten to the point where I understand the curiosity. I understand that I look different than other people, and I'm okay with that most of the time. I understand that people's human curiosity rules them. It really does. And I don't blame them for that. I love that people are curious. I just love it more when they act on their curiosity. I love it when parents try to educate their kids. I don't think it's disabled people's job necessarily to educate non-disabled people. However, I love educating people. That's not to say that all disabled people love to be educators. That's not to say if you see any random disabled person on the street, go ask them about their disability, because a lot of people aren't born disabled like me. A lot of people have had some kind of accident, trauma, etc., that has caused them to be disabled. And so when you go up to them and you ask them about their disability, you are essentially asking them to relive their trauma. And to trauma dump on a stranger is a little, it's not a little, it is a lot vulnerable, and it's inappropriate on so many levels, especially like in the aisle of a grocery store. Like, why would I tell you my deepest, darkest traumas and how I have sex and if I can have kids or not, I love educating when it comes from a genuine place of curiosity, when the questions are fueled by wanting to be educated. I will not answer super personal questions unless you are a person in my life. Even then, I might not, and that's okay. I don't think anybody is entitled to that information or entitled to those answers. So personally, I love when people ask questions, especially kids. I love when kids have the courage to come up and ask their questions. But not everybody does. So please keep that in mind. Please keep in mind that not everybody likes that, and a lot of people are very uncomfortable with that. But basically, I wanted to create this episode of this podcast because I get so many comments every day and DMs on all platforms that say, oh, I wish I had your confidence. Because of you, I feel more confident myself. And that's so great. I love that people are finding confidence through me. That's amazing. Be confident. But I don't want to spread the misinformation that I'm confident in my body all the time, because that's just not the reality. Sometimes I am, but sometimes I'm not. And those are valid emotions. Everything is valid. Those are both very valid emotions that I feel. And I just didn't want to create this facade that, like, I'm confident in my body 24/7, when that's not really the case. So thank you so much for watching and listening to this episode of The View from 4 Feet and 3 Inches. Please give it a 5-star rating, subscribe, like, comment if you're on one of those platforms. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.